I've always had a fondness for games, and over the last 6 years, my experience with Elliott has allowed me to observe that many of the same concepts which existed in some games that were very familiar to me were also evident in the Elliott Wave Principle. Because it's sometimes helpful to grasp a new concept by relating it to an old concept that you're familiar with, I've chosen 3 games that I think are representative of those concepts, and I'd like to discuss them briefly. The first game is chess. And chess is basically a game of pattern recognition. Your ability to see ahead several moves in the game will be crucial to your success against your opponent, who's also trying to look ahead several moves in the game. The Elliott Wave Principle is also based on pattern recognition in the concept of wave counting. Your ability to assess the various paths that the market can move over within the parameters of Elliott, Bob talked about the rules earlier, will directly relate to your success in the markets. Now, in Elliott, these paths are referred to as wave counts, and we're going to be talking about those today. The belief that there is only one path that the market can take, and the refusal to assess other alternative paths, is a prescription that will get you into trouble. And we'll also take a look at that. The second game is bridge. Now, bridge is a very structured card game with 2 basic rules. There are 4 suits: spades, hearts, diamonds, and clubs. And when a suit is led, it is required that the other players, or that all the players at the table, follow suit. Otherwise, the player is reneging. Additionally, there is a trump suit which is declared just prior to the play of the hand, which can be played when you're void in another suit and win the trick in question. If you trump a trick when you're not void in that suit, you're reneging. You're not following the rules of the game as they're defined, and you're probably not going to be invited back to that table. Now, Elliott is also a structured system with a fixed set of rules. As Bob mentioned, wave 3 among waves 1, 3, and 5 can never be the shortest wave. Wave 2 cannot exceed the origin of wave 1, and wave 4 cannot overlap wave 1 within a 5-wave structure. There are some so-called practitioners of Elliott out there today who continually violate these rules, and they still proclaim to be using Elliott. They aren't, and they really shouldn't confuse those people who are interested in learning Elliott with a distortion of what is really the simple beauty that Elliott has to offer us. Now, one other aspect of bridge, which will lead us into the third game that we'll talk about this morning, is the concept of finessing a trick. Bridge involves bidding on the individual hands, which indicates strengths and weaknesses in those hands. Given the opportunity during the play of the game, a successful finesse will be achieved more often than not by correctly assessing the probabilities of where the cards lie. And when you're talking about probabilities, the first game that comes to mind is poker. I don't care if you're talking about 5-card stud, 7-card stud, 5-card draw. We're all taught from a very, very early age that you don't draw to an inside straight. It's a low probability outcome, and if you continue to do it, it may very well be an early night. Additionally, if you've got a handful of garbage with the 5 cards that you've been dealt or whatever you've drawn, you don't have to play the hand. You've got your initial ante at risk, and that's it. There's no requirement that you put additional money down on the table. Now, the guidelines and wave personalities that were described by R.N. Elliott over 50 years ago enable us to assess the probabilities that our wave count is correct. And in those cases when the probabilities are low across the board, as is typical in corrective patterns, your money is best left in your pocket. You don't have to play. Now, finally, a common thread throughout all these games is the psychology that's relative to the opponent. In chess, your opponent is seated across the table from you, sometimes with his back to you, but always across the table. In bridge, your opponents are seated adjacent to you. Your partner is seated across from you, so there's a subtle difference there. In poker, your opponents are seated around the table or the campfire. As long as the requisite gin bottles are there, it doesn't really matter. In the market, though, it gets a bit more interesting, because first you've got the market itself as your opponent. Then you've got all those tens of thousands of people out there who think they're at least as smart, if not smarter than you, or at least as lucky, if not luckier than you are, and they're all your opponents. But in the market, you've also got yourself as an opponent. You hear that little voice that's telling you you're wrong, and you start second-guessing yourself. And then you start wondering, well, this is what my analysis tells me about the market, but what about the trade deficit? What about the non-farm payroll figures? What about the revised GNP numbers that are due out a week from Thursday? Is Elvis alive, and will he testify against Drexel? It all combines to add yet another dimension to the game. So what do we have? We talked about chess. Chess is a game based on pattern recognition. We're going to talk about Elliott. Elliott pattern recognition is seen in wave counts. If you can't see several moves ahead in a game of chess, if you can't assess the alternate counts, you're going to lose your king and the game is over. We talked about bridge. Bridge has a fixed set of rules. Elliott has a fixed set of rules. They're not to be broken. If you break the rules, you're just not playing the same game. We talked about poker, which is based on probabilities. In Elliott, when we talk about probabilities, what we're looking at are guidelines and wave personalities. We'll look at those later this afternoon. If you continue to bet on low probability outcomes, it's going to be an early night. These are the three main topics that we'll cover today. And the underlying theme throughout all of this, which makes it all possible, is psychology.